The word science gets thrown around a lot when people talk about cycling training.
The science.
The science.
Modern science. The science. Fascinating science.
So, you can imagine my surprise when in early 2023, when I was scrolling Twitter and I saw this tweet from Oz Cycling's endurance training scientist, Dr. Peter Leo, who is also a coach for the men's and women's professional cycling Jayco Alula teams. Seeing his take on cycling training, that he doesn't believe in any training method for an endurance athlete, matched with what seems like his personal mantra of just accumulate a lot of work and sometimes go hard, made me realize I wasn't alone in thinking that science isn't really capable of definitively answering the question, what is the perfect training plan? Because let's get real here. There's science, the systematic study of the world through observation and experimentation, and there's the evidence that it produces. And when you start looking for answers to your cycling performance questions, you won't find as many as you'd think. And that's the thing about science and cycling training. Evidence can inform parts of the training process, but there are no clear-cut training methods that are scientifically proven. Now, I'll admit that I'm as guilty as anyone else when it comes to using the term science to discuss training. However, in the past 12 months, I've undergone a big shift in mindset. So when the scientist that Australia's cycling governing body trusts with guiding their endurance training has this type of opinion, you begin to ask questions that might shake your core beliefs about the science behind endurance training. Well, it did for me anyway. To understand my journey and see why it could be relevant for you as well, in this video, I'm going to explore 3 pivotal ideas, but we warned these might challenge your current training beliefs, but they hold the potential to revolutionize your mindset. Number 1, the level of evidence supporting your training may not be as strong as you believe. This is an idea I got from my coaching colleague, Jason Boynton, PhD. I call it level of evidence. Meaning, what's the level of evidence for this session, this training plan, etc. Here's what this might actually look like, taking some ideas from examine.com and their evidence grades. Starting with a single training intervention, it will have its own level of evidence. Then moving to a week, and every session will have its own level of evidence, with the combination of sessions over a week having its own level of evidence again. And already you will see we are bumping into the limitations of science. But let's look at an example at the session level, where you think the level of evidence must be high, especially for common training sessions. Zone 2. It's been a hot topic for the last few years, so confirming the evidence should be easy. This is what scientist Benjamin Bickman, PhD, tried to do on Twitter when he asked the question, does anyone have published evidence that Zone 2 training increases mitochondrial biogenesis compared with other zones? I see here claims, but I want to see the studies. And if I asked you, what do you think? Did Dr. Bickman get an answer? How about if I say Indigo San Milan, PhD, jumped in the thread? When the person that gave rise to the concept, the coach of the world's #1 professional road cyclist, says this.
There's one small study, I'll post the link. I started using the Z2 concept 26 years ago, and throughout the empirical experience with thousands of athletes, as well as clinical populations I see, that is the intensity that increases mitochondrial function the most.
That study didn't get linked later, but even if it was, you start to really doubt the level of scientific evidence being used even at the top level of the sport. I'll cut ISM some slack here and note that the use of empirical evidence alone without intervention studies is not inherently a red flag when evaluating a scientist's work. It's just a different level of evidence to intervention studies, but reliance solely on empirical evidence could be a limitation, especially when exploring causal relationships. You see my point though. Here we have a high-level coach quoting a small study that he never actually posts, plus some empirical evidence only he has access to as the basis of his information, which he then talks about in detail all over the internet. And here's my main issue with this. When a coach says to train a certain way, either with training philosophies, recommendations, etc., people may assume there's a reasonable basis why they are saying that. This is, they've seen it work, they have some form of scientific evidence. But even the best coaches are often wrong about why something works. And if you're wrong about why something works, you can employ it at the wrong time or with the wrong athletes, even if the recommendation does work much of the time. To round out this point, all training has some level of evidence, and some, read many, might have none at all. Does this matter? Like, do we need to know the science? I mean, a training method will go right on working with or without evidence. Well, in an ideal world, anything that helps better understand the why is useful far beyond the specific recommendations or training methodology in question, because it helps you make sense of all the other, often competing or even contradictory methods that are floating around. So the lesson here is check your sources. Ask your coach to see their sources and ask them why they're prescribing each session, the sequence of sessions, etc. And for the record, I believe I don't know can actually be an acceptable answer because most of the time we just don't know. Number 2, there is no perfect training plan. This follows on from my last point and probably a little bit more controversial to say, but the truth is there are some questions that science isn't really capable of definitively answering, with what is the perfect training plan being one of them. Sure, we can get some answers on adaptations to certain stresses, but specific plans that include multiple intensities over a week, a month, a year? Nope. All of these are separate interventions and have a lot of moving parts, and technically, each one has a specific level of evidence, which is most likely none. And when we start talking longer training interventions, we're starting to talk about periodization. And what is the body of evidence for periodization models? As far as I can tell, all periodization models are super wonky. And as John Keeley continues to remind us in his various papers on the topic, the original scientific platform upon which periodization theory was founded has disintegrated, all stemming from no longer scientifically justifiable assumptions like the science of stress, particularly the work of Hans Selye, who developed the general adaptation syndrome, GAS, that is repeatedly cited by theorists as a central pillar upon which periodization theory is founded. This is definitely a topic to cover in its own right, but let's just say that periodization paradigms, even to this day, are tradition-driven rather than evidence-led. Plus, there are large holes in any periodization theory. So what does this mean? I think a lot of people get caught up with not knowing what they need or what's really important. We all too easily get caught up in the training of professional riders like Tadej Pogacar, or methods like the Norwegian method or 80-20. We form camps after cherry-picking some aspect of the training we like, but none of these are based on high levels of evidence. The point here is that it's not really about the science at this level. I believe it's about something else completely, which I'll mention in number 3, but it's more about being aware that almost all types of training have some impact on performance. I'm not sure this is what Dr. Leo meant when he tweeted, "I don't believe in any training method for an endurance athlete," but for me, this means forget about finding the perfect training plan and instead work on your own individual training and response to that training. But stepping through the training process with hundreds of athletes, the one thing I'm certain of is how different everyone is. Their physiology, their motivation, the time they have to dedicate to training, etc. So sure, start with something, but change it based on data and real responses rather than thinking something will change just from a random tweak in a program. End rant. Number 3, physical training is not as important as you think. This belief came to me in a specific message exchange with a friend at the end of last year, and it was an offhand answer to a question about cycling performance that gave me more clarity on cycling performance than I've ever had before. The exchange with my friend went like this. I've just read a paper from this person on using a qualitative method to discover insights held by the world's best endurance athletes. After I gave him my feedback, he asked me a question that started me down this path of questioning everything I knew about cycling performance. The question? Well, it was this. What do you think the best performances in pro cycling come from, aside from the training? My answer surprised me because I hadn't put this into words before this moment. And my answer was this. I think it's about handling the maximum workload a person's mind and body can handle without going over the edge and doing that for years. In other words, Eddie Merckx's ride lots is definitely part of getting better, but I see the key on the coaching side is buy-in from the athlete. And it's not just me who thinks this. 106 coaches from a number of countries were asked about their planning and training processes, and there were two responses to a question that got my attention. This question: how important do you think the following factors are in modifying how well athletes physically adapt to the training plan? The first response was the answer physical training, with a very important rating of 62%. The more surprising answer was at the same percentage, 62%, which was the answer athletes' belief in the plan. Wowza. So belief in the plan may be just as important as the physical training. This highlights two things: the role of commitment, both from athletes and coaches, and credibility gained through experience or study. It must be a key factor in maintaining an athlete's commitment. Where does this leave us? Well, these beliefs have motivated me to make some changes in my mindset and coaching approach. I've realized I need to take a step back from being overly reductionist in my thinking and instead focus on clarifying my process and questioning my ideas. However, there is a contradiction here, and that is, if everything I said is true, then no coaches have scientific-based training plans. If they tell you they do, then run away. In fact, ignore anyone who is very certain in the advice that they give you, because when you see someone say this is the best way to train or the only way, ask them why. Ask them if the performance boosting sessions have evidence. Who are they for? Ask people to explain. My bet is they don't know how the sausage is made, even if they do have success. And this type of person is probably creeping into cult of personality territory. For example, the Linear method anchored entirely on empirical findings. And as Professor Joyner says, Arthur Linear was charismatic, then he had some success, and then the rest is history. Instead, trust coaches who are confident and humble. There are times when the science doesn't match the training, which is less about coaches or innovation that is ahead of the science and more about finding a partner in your individual path. But I'm getting carried away with a totally different topic, and I get back to it. At the start of this journey, I told you I'll deconstruct your world and then I'll reconstruct it with two ideas that will create a strong foundation that you can build from. Well, here they are. Number one, being an experiment of one. And this is how I employ the scientific method into my coaching. Number two is giving a and this works for coaching or for information. And let's quickly cover these so you can use them in your cycling. Number one, each of us is an experiment of one. And this means having an experimentality, You get it? Yeah, thanks, Dad. So instead of relying only on specific training methods or periodization paradigms, an experimentality pushes you to run controlled experiments to find the truth in the data. In other words, it pushes you to know why you are doing something. And this is science at its core, defined as the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the world through observation and experimentation. And as a refresher, here are the steps of the scientific method. This seems like a pretty useful way to understand yourself and get faster, right? Because ultimately, your biggest breakthroughs will come from discovering your own path. Number two, giving up is the job of a coach, but it also applies to athletes and translates to giving about everything. Whether it's filtering through the BS or genuinely searching for the truth, I came to this conclusion after seeing inside too many athletes' training peaks accounts with training plans that lacked thought, they lacked details, or they just straight up lacked feedback. And that's when I took a stand. And even if I don't know everything, sometimes all there is left is giving up. And that covers athletes and information that I supply to them. If you're not a coach, then it simply means caring enough to question your own methods and information sources, taking that extra step to make sure you understand the level of evidence you're working off and how that impacts your decisions on what to test and when. I'm not here to say that science is a waste of time or that we should ignore what's out there. Science has given us some answers about what makes cyclists faster. It just doesn't have all the answers. And to make up for that fact, we have to do some work to find out what works for each individual through the scientific process as an experiment of one. Having someone that cares about you through this process helps a lot, but even if you are doing this on your own, a little bit of extra work goes a long way in helping you achieve your goals.